sandals is kind of how he words it. So we're standing in their sandals, seeing things from their point of view. And so I've titled the sermon series, Standing in Their Sandals, and I just want to talk about characters from the Bible and take application from them and just see things how they saw it. And so when I was thinking about what Bible person I wanted to do, we were studying Genesis, and a character really popped out to me that I don't think about that often, and I don't think a lot of us do because he's kind of overshadowed. But I want to talk about Lot for this first one. Lot is an interesting person. He played an interesting part in the account of Genesis, and I think that he had some really important characteristics that we can take and apply to our own lives. So let's look at some ways that Lot was an example for us. But before we find those three ways that Lot was an example, we need to know some background for Lot. So in Genesis chapter 11, we find that Lot was the son of Haran, the nephew of Abraham, and the grandson of Terah. And in Genesis 11, verse 28, it says, Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his birth in Ur of the Chaldeans. So we have no idea how Haran died. And we have no idea how old Lot was, but you have to imagine that probably took a toll on him. Lot had to grow up without his father, or at least live the rest of his life without his father. And I grew up without a father, so I can kind of empathize with Lot here. My dad died when I was a year old, and so I know how hard it is to be a young man and have the expectations of being the man of your house, the man of your family placed on you. If something needed to be reached off the top shelf, I was taller than everybody else, so I was the one that was called. If a jar needed to be opened, I was the strongest one, so I was the one that was called. If the lawn needed to be mowed, they asked me to do it. So you have a lot of responsibility thrust on you as a young man when you have to grow up without a father. And this is just a side application that I want us to find from this text, but a young man without a father needs a good male role model to show them how a man should act. And a young woman that doesn't have a mother needs a good female role model to show them how a woman should act. I personally had multiple men from my home congregation that stepped up, that treated me like I was their own son. And you can bet that Lot had that in these great men in Abram and Terah. He had people that showed him how a man should act, and I had that same thing. So if a situation ever arises in your life where there's a young man or a young woman that needs somebody to show them how they should act, I hope you're willing to step out of your comfort zone and mentor that person, because I'm sure Lot needed it, and I know I needed it. I can tell you from personal experience that I would not be a Christian today if it wasn't for those men that stepped out of their comfort zones and mentored me. I wouldn't be a student at Bear Valley. I wouldn't be standing here preaching to you right now if it wasn't for those men. And we never get any mention of Lot having brothers, so it was especially important in his time, the time that he lived, to step up, to take charge, and to lead his family. A woman in that day didn't have many rights, didn't have many ways to make a living. Think about Ruth. Her husband died. Naomi's husband died. She had no sons, and so Naomi was basically going to have to go back to her hometown and be poor. I mean, she had no other option, but Ruth stayed with her. Ruth went and picked the grain for her, and eventually Ruth ended up marrying Boaz and granting Naomi with an heir. So you see from like that example that a family without a man was really in bad shape in those times. And so Lot especially had to step up and he had to take charge in his family. He didn't have the perfect upbringing, but he still ended up being a good man and a leader. And he made some mistakes. We'll see that in the text. But I still think that we can take some application from him, some examples from him. So the first thing we're going to see is that Lot was an example for us of faith. Chapter 12, 1 through 3. Now the Lord said to Abram, Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you, and I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and so you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth will be blessed. So we always look at this and we see how great of an example that Abram was. If you look all the way back in Hebrews chapter, or all the way forward, in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, by faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. God never tells Abraham, or Abram at this point, that he's going to the land of Canaan. God said go, he went. It's like God said jump. Abram didn't ask how high, he just jumped. He took the leap of faith and went. And obviously, he figured out where he was going. He ended up in the land of Canaan. But it took a lot of faith for him to go. When I think about this, I kind of think about the idea of like a GPS. So I remember when I was younger, my mom would have to load those things before we got in the car, set it up, and then we'd have our destination mapped and we'd go. Nowadays, we just have our phones. We can do it on our phones. But I can type in that address by myself. I can look at the route, and I can have faith that it's going to take me exactly where I want to go because I did it myself. I double-checked myself, and so I can trust that it's going to get me where I need to go and with the best possible route. And it's easy to trust something when it's firsthand. You looked at that GPS yourself, you know that it's accurate. But I think Lot is just as much an example of faith in this text as Abraham, if not more. Lot went with Abraham. We see that in verse 4. So Abram went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So Lot went with him. He didn't have to go. He chose to go with Abram, and I'm sure that Lot trusted Abram. It was his uncle, so he knew that Abram would protect him, but he was the second-hand recipient of God's command. Lot going is kind of like a situation Lauren and I have ran into many times in our relationship where we've been going somewhere new, and so she puts it into the GPS, she holds the phone, and she tells me where we're going. That has caused some of the biggest arguments that we have ever had. I mean, I'll be in the fast lane, it'll tell me that I have 500 feet, and Lauren will say, hey, you have 500 feet, you need to get off right here. It's like, Lauren, there's 3 lanes between me, I can't. That's caused some of our biggest fights because I trust her, I trust that she put it in right, but it's harder when it's not firsthand, when you're not seeing it for yourself. So Lauren and I have learned now that the driver needs to be the one holding the phone. Like I said, it led to some major arguments. We'd miss turns, we'd waste time, and in my notes I say we would get frustrated. It was me. I would get frustrated every time. And it's kind of like in this text, Lot is the one driving, and Abram's holding the GPS, and he's guiding Lot. Lot didn't receive the revelation from God. God didn't say, hey, Lot, you're going to go with Abram. He just had to trust what Abram said. And I think that applies directly to us as Christians. God isn't speaking to us directly anymore. I don't know about you, but I haven't received any revelations in quite a while. He speaks to us indirectly through His Word. We have a second-hand account of God's words. He gave it to the disciples, to the prophets. They wrote it down, and that's what we have. So, as Christians, we need to follow that example of Lot. We need to trust in that second-hand account. We need to trust that this inspired Word of God is accurate, that it's truthful, and not only that it's leading us where we need to go. So we need to trust Lot's example of faith. The second example from Lot that we're going to see is Lot's example of picking the best. Now, I know that's worded weird, but I promise you'll get it. So Lot followed Abram on the journey to Canaan. In chapter 12, we see that there was a famine, and so Abram went down to Egypt. It can be assumed that Lot went with him or that he stayed. It doesn't really affect it. Chapter 13, Abram returns. Lot's there as well, back in Canaan. But while they're in Canaan, a problem arose. In chapter 13 of Genesis, verses 6 and 7. And the land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. And so this problem arose. They both had so much stuff that they couldn't possibly stay together in such a small land. I don't know if you know anything about livestock. I don't know much, but I know that that's the purpose of things like the cattle drives from back in the Wild West. You couldn't keep animals in one spot because they eat up the grass, they eat up the produce of the land, so you have to move them and let that land replenish and then come back later. And so Abram and Lot both understood this. They both had massive flocks. They couldn't live in one place together with that much. And so they decided that they were going to split. And Abram gave Lot the choice of what part of the land he wanted. And we see Lot's choice in chapter 13, verses 10 and 11. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of the Jordan, and Lot journeyed eastward. Thus they separated from each other. So we see Lot's choice. He chose the greenest, best part of the land that he could. He not only chose the greenest, best part of the land, he chose the place that he could see himself prospering in the future. I mean, look at that description. This is the choice that the majority of us would have made. It's described as like the garden of the Lord. Now, I don't know about you. I think that heaven will be somewhat like the garden. I mean, it's going to be probably the best place that mankind has ever been and ever will be on this earth. And that's how this land looked before Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. So Lot chose this great land where he could see himself prospering, where he could see his herds multiplying, and he could see his possessions becoming greater. That's how a lot of us are. When we see something that we want that's better than what we have, we want it. That's why a new iPhone comes out every single year. That's why people decide to wait around the block at the Apple store for the new iPhone XR when it's not that much better than the iPhone they already have. People want the best thing that they can get. And if you tell somebody that something is better, then they're going to want it. I mean, my mom has the iPhone that doesn't have a headphone jack anymore. I don't think that's any better than mine, but she decided that she wanted a better phone. It was marketed as better, and so she bought it. And this point of this lesson, it's not about something that we need to do. Our first point was we need to have that faith that Lot had. This point is kind of looking more towards the past. Each person here made the choice to be a Christian. We looked at the land possibilities, if you will, like Lot did, and we saw a better life than the one that we were living, a life where we could prosper in the future. The lifestyle of Christianity is so much better than that of the world because of the future that it promises. We have the chance to live eternally in heaven because we chose to pick the best place. Just like Lot chose the better land, we chose the better life. And when times get hard and it seems like the world is out to get you, we need to look to that prospering that we're going to be able to do in our next life. So Lot's second example is an example of choosing the best, just like we have done. And our third and our final example is that Lot was an example for us of persevering righteousness. So Lot went and he chose to live near Sodom. And God was about to destroy the city because of how wicked that they were. Now, Lot made a bad choice. He shouldn't have gone and lived by Sodom because of how wicked those people were. But Sodom was a hub. If Lot wanted to go and trade goods, Sodom was probably the place to do it in the land that he chose. And so he went and lived there. Sodom was terribly wicked. God was going to destroy it. And in Genesis 18, Abraham tries to save the city. He says, God, if there's 50 righteous people, you won't destroy it, right? And God says, okay, 50. And he goes 45. And God says, okay, 45, 40, 30, 20, all the way down to 10. And God says, if there's 10 righteous people, I won't destroy Sodom. But there weren't. And so God was going to destroy it. But he loved Abraham. And so he sent 2 angels to save Lot. And our first example of that righteousness of Lot that persevered even though he was surrounded by a wicked society is when the 2 angels came, how Lot greeted them. He greeted them in the same way that Abraham greeted them in chapter 18, verse 2. When he, talking about Abraham, lifted up his eyes and looked, behold, 3 men were standing opposite him. And when he saw them, he ran from the tent door to meet them and bowed himself to the earth. So that's Abraham's example. And Abraham, we'll all agree, was very righteous. 19, 1 through 3. Now the 2 angels came to Sodom in the evening, as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. When Lot saw them, he rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He said, Now behold, my lords, please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet, that you may rise early and go on your way. They said, however, No, but we shall spend the night in the square. Yet he urged them strongly, so they entered aside to him and entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. Lot was a pretty good host. I mean, he practically begged them to stay with him and then prepared a whole feast for them so they could eat. And he didn't know at this point, we have no indication that he knew that they were angels. This is just how a righteous person of that day would treat visitors. They would hold them like they were a member of their household. They would hold them in high esteem. When someone was your guest, they were under your protection. In verse 2, however, we saw some foreshadowing. They were going to stay in the square. The 2 angels were told Lot, we're going to stay in the square of the town. But Lot knew just how bad it was, and so he begged them to stay with him instead. Lot understood the wickedness of the society around him, and he saw the angels were about to make a poor decision. So he did everything he could to save them. Now, we'll talk about it some more here in a second. I don't think our society is nearly as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah. But when we see somebody in our wicked society going and doing something that is going to negatively affect them, going to stay in the square of the town, just like these angels were going to do, are we willing to step out and beg them to come back to Christ, to come back to salvation? Because Lot was willing to step in, and he begged them to come stay with him because he saw how poor of a decision that was. And then we see Lot's interaction with the wicked people, starting in 19, verse 5. They called to Lot and said to him, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us, that we may have relations with them." So the men of the city were going to sexually assault the angels for no reason other than the fact that they wanted to. I don't know if you can see it, but it sounds kind of like where our culture is headed. We live in a world where people do what they want, when they want, how they want, because they can. Think about, in some states, abortion until birth is being legalized. Gender is on a spectrum. Religious rights are being stripped from people left and right. We could go on and on and on and on about how terrible our society is becoming. Don't misunderstand me. Like I said, I don't think our society is half as bad as Sodom and Gomorrah were. I mean, God wiped them from the face of the planet. But we're on a path that we probably shouldn't be taking, and we need to see that, how wicked our society is becoming. And Lot lived among this evil society, just like Christians do. But I think we can take some things from Lot's interaction and his righteousness that will help us deal with the wickedness of our society. So we'll read verses 6 through 8. Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind him and said, "Please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you and do to them whatever you like. Only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof." So Lot does 2 things. The first argument that Lot has with them is he begs them to not act wickedly. In verse 9, they said, "Stand aside." Furthermore, they said, "This one came in as an alien, and already he is acting like a judge." It made them angry. They felt like Lot was judging them by asking them to not act wickedly. I think that was the best thing that Lot could have done. He wasn't judging them. He was judging their sins. He was telling them that those sins weren't to be done in the presence of him and in the presence of his household. We have to hold on to our right to say no to sin and make sure that sin isn't invited into our houses. Lot told them no. He told them that it was a wicked act. He understood that it was sin. But then the second thing that Lot tried to do was to appease them, and it failed miserably. In verse 8, he offers his 2 daughters to the men to leave the angels alone, and that's really confusing to us. He offered his daughters in the place of 2 strangers, but that's what hospitality looked like. He makes it clear in verse 8, "They have come under the shelter of my roof." Those angels were under his protection, and he was willing to do anything to keep them safe, to keep them out of the harm of those people of the city. And we have no indication that Lot knew these were angels yet. He still just understood that they were men. But it was that important to him, and that's what a righteous person did in that day, was to protect the people under his house. But the offering ultimately was ignored because they wanted more. Compromise is never an option when it comes to sin. Whenever I think of compromise, I think about the years leading up to World War II, the 1930s. Britain tried to employ the strategy of appeasement with Germany. So Hitler would invade Austria, and Britain would say, "Hey, you can have Austria, but don't do that again. Don't invade anywhere else." And Germany said, okay, you're right. And then they would invade Czechoslovakia, and Britain would say, "Hey, you can have Czechoslovakia, you can have Austria, but don't invade anywhere else." And this went on constantly in the 1930s until eventually World War II had to start. And the reason why is because Germany always wanted more. Germany had their mind set on the bigger picture. They wanted to conquer Europe. And so Britain would throw Austria, throw Czechoslovakia in there to try and cloud their view, but they had their goal set on conquering all of Europe, and that's why appeasement didn't work. And I think Lot tried to do this exact same thing. They had their eyes set on these 2 angels, and so Lot throws his daughters in the mix to try and cloud their view, to try and stop them from doing that. Yet they still went ahead, and they were looking at this big picture. They wouldn't be fazed by what Lot was trying to do. You can't compromise with the side that's always going to take more than you're willing to give. Lot tried to offer this in place of the 2 men, And we see how the men acted. The angels reached out their hands, brought Lot into the house with them, shut the door. They struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the door. And verse 11, 19 verse 11. I never really thought about it. They're blind. They can't even see that goal, but they wearied themselves trying to find the door. That's how dead set these wicked people were on getting to that goal. You can't compromise with a side that's always going to try and take more than you're willing to give. In 2014, the city of Houston subpoenaed any preacher's sermon that was about homosexuality, and they threatened criminal charges. We can't compromise. Think about the Christian baker from over in Lakewood. He wouldn't compromise on his views. He went to court. He fought it because he wouldn't compromise with sin. So with all of the examples we have of Lot, this is the one that we can't follow, his example of compromising. Now, I really enjoy the story of Lot. He's not someone we always think about. I think he gets overshadowed by Abraham quite a bit. But he still is a really good example to us. We should follow his example of faithfulness in the second hand. We received God's word second hand, just like Lot received God's command second hand, but he still stayed true to it. We should follow his example of picking the best. As we're going through this life, we should continue to look towards the best, that area where we'll be able to prosper. And we should follow his example of persevering righteousness. We should follow his examples of the way that he interacted with him, condemning their wickedness, but we can't follow that example of compromise. I enjoyed doing this lesson, and I hope that you've gotten something out of it, that you've learned from these examples of Lot that we've seen. And I hope that you've really learned some things you can apply to your life as we have stood in the sandals of Lot, if you will. Tonight, whatever your need is, I hope that you know that you can come forward and that this congregation would love to pray with you, hug you, cry with you, tell you how loved you are if you have any needs. Or maybe tonight you've been studying baptism and you know it's what you need to do. Whatever your need is, come forward as we stand and as we sing.